I'm not an audio engineer, or I would know how to clean that up.
It doesn't matter. I'm probably gonna be peeing a lot because I've been sick, so I've been just drinking like 3 gallons of water a day
Yeah.
and just been like flushing my system.
Dude, I'm down for breaks because I feel like fucking crazy town over here.
Because
I've
of
just been
color.
crazy for weeks.
Yeah,
Because of color, because of packing,
yeah,
uh, because of job.
yeah. I'm glad. It actually feels good to be podcasting again, dude. Back to the show.
I am.
Yeah,
Podcasting's my whole livelihood now, so
yeah.
can't can't say I have the same feelings, but it feels good to, be talking about something that I don't know a lot about, but don't have to pretend to, but at least something I'm vaguely interested in.
Yeah, this is gonna be fun, I think. As fun as it can be for that. When you're talking about theory of the lyric.
Goodbye, Mormon vampires. Never missed them so much.
Yeah, and after this, since we took that, I didn't even prepare an intro for Color, which I was thinking I should, because I mean nobody knows who this guy is.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy, heavy, heavy.
Bored.
I may say male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
Yeah, I mean, you only know who Culler is if you get, one of his. He does that little theory book that a lot of like intro English classes will teach, literary theory. It's like, one of those tiny books. They have one that's also like critical theory that I think is a big one.
It's the very short introduction series of books you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would go get it, but I'd have to get up and
Yeah.
it just doesn't feel worth it.
Yeah, but those that don't know, I mean, he's basically just like a hotshot professor. He's at Cornell, I guess, or was he at Chicago? The book says he's at Cornell, but I don't know. I guess that's where he is.
Damn, we don't get I'm surprised it doesn't say.
The book just says that he's like a professor of English and comparative literature at Cornell.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
That's what they say. But I think he mentioned that I think at one point in his career he did work at like U of Chicago or some other, maybe Syracuse or like one of the other kind of big schools.
Yeah.
Where they can afford to have people with professors in English and comparative literature on staff and tenured, I guess. Which is very few colleges now, but yeah. Alright, but another episode of Heavy Board. I'm Andrew Whitstadt.
I'm Sophie Weiner.
And today we're doing Jonathan Culler's Theory of the Lyrics. So this, and we have the same version of this, Harvard University Press.
It's the only one you can get.
Yeah. A little
Only one
pricey,
there is.
but for a paperback. But if you're into poetry, it's something worth buying. As always, we're going to link it in the description as we go into this.
Yeah, it is like an academic text, so those are always a little bit pricier, especially if they're new and not considered like a staple.
Yeah, and people aren't going to buy them, so you got to make your money back if you're printing that. At least to break even if they're doing that, even with like books like this for publishing. I guess Harvard has enough money that they can just support a press, like the endowment can just support a press for infinity as long as civilization exists. But first things first, housekeeping. We've been forgetting to do this the last couple episodes here. We've been having too much fun talking about vampires fucking each other.
We're waiting to fuck each other.
Waiting to fuck each other. So for listeners listening, we're looking for workshop horror stories. If you have a workshop horror story you want to share with us, send that to heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. We'd like to get that started and commiserate with you. That would be a lot of fun. Subscribe to support us if you don't want to join Patreon, can't afford it. Subscribe to this pod on any of your platform that you choose. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can support us that way. Or or leave a 5-star review. We could appreciate it. It'll help us out. Doesn't cost you anything. Well, maybe it does. That's it. Send us your workshop horror stories. Again, at heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. And we'll get that started. But that was pretty much it. I've been waiting for people to send us those, but I guess we just don't have any listeners, so nobody sends those in. They're too embarrassed.
Yeah, well, what if it's like really awful and someone like called you a bigot and like you are one? Yeah, I guess that's the worst case scenario.
Yeah. I guess I was gonna say that's I mean that's most.
I've never personally seen it happen in a workshop.
I mean, I've seen people that weren't be accused of it just because.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
It's
That
the
hasn't.
thing to do.
I've
but-
heard of that happening. I haven't witnessed it myself.
Yeah, I mean, throughout my workshops, there's been at least a blow up every fucking time that there's.
Well, that's fun.
Yeah, so I assume I'm not alone in that. Like everybody has these blow ups, but
I have plenty of horror stories, but not that particular example.
fucking Culler, dude. How do you want to? I guess let's just do thoughts, and then we'll start breaking it. Initial thoughts, reactions.
In really small bites, I can take this book in really small bites. This was hard for me to stay awake reading. It really was. It was a challenge. I did not help that at all because half the time I was like trying to read at night. So I'd fall asleep, but also a couple times during the day. It's really academic. I like it in pieces. There are moments that I find myself getting into it. But I can't like sit down. I mean, even one chapter of reading, I had to break up into days.
Yeah. Like Sophie said, it's an academic text, so this is not an easy read. And those that read these types of things often, you kind of get the academic kind of jargon, kind of, not like I don't want to say like head up their own ass or anything, but just like these words that like you don't understand unless you have a master's degree in the subject kind of thing. And then of course the academic trick where they like to redefine commonly used terms to fit their arguments. So they'll be using a word that you could, use at any given time. And everybody knows what it means, but then they're using it a very particular way, like giving it a name. So that's annoying when you're reading through these books, but...
Well, I think that happens a lot with discussions of poetry in particular, which I tend to be kind of forgiving of just because that tends to be the nature of poetry anyway.
Well, it just means so like that makes it so that it's not like a general audience appeal.
Yeah, it's really not.
Yeah.
I mean, I am a pretty regular reader of poetry, and this is a text for an academic audience. It's like the kind of book that you pull off a library shelf if you are writing a paper.
Yeah, or a thesis with this using this long, dense text. And Culler says in this, too, I guess in the introduction, where he says that this is basically his life's work. Although, we'll get to the end of this, we're kind of like, all right. But yeah, for me, this was a hard read. This was hard to get through. It took a lot of reading and rereading, like, and a lot of the structure is like super. It's so dense to the point where
Well,
you,
yeah, it's what, 360 pages or something
yeah,
about.
yeah, with like another 100 pages of citation, because you have to have all the citations at the end of a book like this in the notes section. It's about 40 pages for like a works cited essentially. It is organized nicely. So again, it's like organized and set up to be an academic text. So this might be the most academic book we've done so far, I think, right?
I mean, would you say that Harold Bloom's essay wasn't academic? This is maybe a more complete academic text.
Harold Bloom's stuff, it was academic,
But
but he has a way of writing, and this is why he's more popular than somebody like Culler, because he can write to a general audience, where it's clear that Culler is
yeah.
kind of incapable of writing towards non-graduate students.
Yeah.
Whereas Bloom could make everybody kind of understand what he's saying, and Bloom was incredibly
Well,
charming.
and he was also, I mean, to be fair, we were looking at an essay that was about how to read poetry and was directed at, younger or newer readers.
Right, and it
This is
was like,
clearly not.
and it was an introductory essay to an anthology,
Yeah.
not this, but yeah, this is definitely the most academic thing we've talked about so far. And my overall thing, I was intrigued at parts of this. I talked to Sophie about this. I was intrigued because I think Color raises a lot of important ideas in this, but at the same time, I was disappointed because I don't think he actually goes into like an answer for all this.
Yeah, well, and I don't think that he actually, by the end of it, he's like, I'm not pretending to, and I think he says this at the beginning too, like, I'm
Yeah,
not
he does.
pretending to, give you some comprehensive guide to reading the lyric or an answer to what precisely the lyric is, but more of an exploration of all of the possibilities and maybe offering some critique of some of them and pulling out what is useful from others. But I don't think he intends to provide some comprehensive, like, this is what the lyric is and this is how it should be read.
Yeah, which is what I was expecting from this book, and it didn't happen.
Yeah, and I don't think this is giving anything away in our conversation, but what can one say in conclusion? I have not attempted to determine what is or is not a lyric, but have been asking what is the best model of the lyric for encouraging a capacious appreciation of these poems, which we hear about a lot.
Yeah.
A capacious appreciation.
And he really doesn't give us a model for that either. I guess he does, but he doesn't
He
state it
does, but the
explicitly.
thing is, yeah, well, we'll get to this. I think he does a good job of, offering up the points where, like, he's trying to offer us a way of maybe understanding how to appreciate these poems more, but I don't think, with the exception of getting into like the nitty gritty like details, and maybe that's, all you can really do with something as sort of potentially dense a subject as poetry.
Yeah.
I just don't. I guess it feels like a lot of these points as he was making them, I was like, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
and what? Like,
Right.
as a person who like learned to read poetry already, reads poetry, has studied it to some degree, though certainly not to the degree that he has. A lot of the ways that he suggests to appreciate poems don't feel, and I don't think he's pretending that they're new, but they don't feel new to me. And I think I was hoping that I would find something that was new to me.
Yeah, I mean, I was just hoping for because he does raise points that I think are more interesting than what he actually does in the book, but he doesn't
Yeah.
go into them enough because he's kind of very much focused on this overall summary to make this like I guess he feels, and this is kind of how you're trained in academics too, is like to make a claim, you have to address the entire history. And I'd say that's probably what the first 200 pages of this book are, is what this book is just a summary of all the all the frameworks for interpreting or reading lyric poetry throughout history. And mostly, I guess, what is it, like 19th century French is when it really, this started, is what he seems to focus on the most, because that's when this really started to, I guess, be, this theory of the lyrics started being presented. I mean, there were always stuff, because he goes back to Aristotle, he goes back to this stuff, but I would say the bulk of it is he's referring to kind of the, 19th century French scholars and writers.
There's a lot of that, but I would say we get into contemporary too.
Yeah, of course, you have to.
But yeah, it is clear very quickly that he's very well studied in, theory and criticism.
All right, so he lays this down in the preface here. This is page 8 of the preface, first full paragraph. Skipping ahead, it says, literary study should be devoted not to developing new and more intricate interpretations of literary works, but to exploring the underlying structures and conventions that enable literary works to have the meanings and effects they do for readers. In short, that poetics should take precedence over, how the fuck do you say that?
Hermeneutics?
Yeah. In short, that poetics should take precedence over hermeneutics. So I think that's basically like what he's trying to get at. And again, going back to like the recent French theory, as he talks about, literary study should be devoted not to developing new and more intricate interpretations of literary works, but to exploring the underlying structures and conventions that enable literary works to have the meanings and effects they do for readers. So I think that's interesting stuff, right? What do we think of this? How do we make this? Do we think that this is accurate, good, missing something?
Well, I think it makes sense. I think, if one of the things that he is sort of starting off saying that he doesn't like about the current maybe approach to studying poetry, and specifically lyric poetry, is that we're hung up on focusing solely on meaning. And I guess specifically this idea that I guess I'm wondering, is that the goal? I mean, I assume he knows better than I do, but I am not reading all of these books that must be coming out then about different ways of understanding and interpreting the same poems over and over again.
Well, he does get into this a little bit further on. This is just the preface where he's kind of laying down an overview. So, I mean, one of the telltale signs that this is like an academic book is that there's a preface and an introduction, both written by him. And they basically say the same things, but they go and like it's the same type of thing we did with Bloom here, where it kind of builds on each thing. Like each chapter tries to build onto the idea, the theory that he's presenting. But structures and conventions, so more of like exploring the underlying structures and conventions that enable literary works to have the meanings and effects they do for readers. So that seems to be the focus of this book, I would say, which is why I highlighted it at least. And I think that's interesting. I mean, I was talking to Sophie about this. I think a lot of this book is much ado about nothing, but that's what academics like to do. They like to kind of create ways that make it harder for people to think about things. But yeah, so it's just like overview of what I would say.
Yeah, well, how does he define hermeneutics? Hang on, I'm finding my notes.
Good luck, dude.
Hermeneutics is about discovering meaning, and poetics is about discovering the conventions that allow for the experience of meaning, or meaning for the reader.
Right.
So Yeah, that gets pretty hairy.
Right.
I don't want
Yeah.
to I don't feel like getting overly hung up on the terminology is necessarily useful in this instance for our purpose.
Right. These minor distinctions that are tedious. I was just gonna move to the introduction here, uh, where he starts talking about lyric as genre. What do you think? I mean, the quote I highlighted on page.
Oh, you mean moving past, wait, are we doing the first chapter or are we skipping to two?
I just did introduction.
Oh,
Just
okay.
not that the first chapter, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing that I got from the intro. Okay, so I mean, there's a lot that he lays out in the introduction that gets repeated throughout the book. There is a lot of discussion of Aristotle, right? So there's a lot of discussion about the idea that poetry is mimesis, right?
Right.
Is an imitation of an action, right? And essentially, he's sort of siding against that and saying, no, this is not mimesis. We aren't poems aren't an imitation of something. They are themselves something that you experience.
Yeah.
He also suggests that a number of things are neglected in discussions of lyric poetry because of our focus on interpretation and trying to discover new interpretations.
Yeah. Um, really, just in terms of this genre where he talks about lyric as genre, uh, he kind of uses the romantic conception of it. Page one, lyric was finally made one of the three fundamental genres during the Romantic period, when a more vigorous and highly developed conception of the individual subject made it possible to conceive of lyric as mimetic, an imitation of the experience of the subject. So, like Sophie was just saying, lyric as opposed to what they would call drama and then epic, like these three different genres. And this is kind of established. It's not like Culler's saying anything new, right? Like he said, this has kind of been established since the Romantic era. Again, going back to that like 19th century French and like English era, right? That's where a lot of this like study of literature really blossomed in the academy, I guess. But he does try to give us. He uses Hegel. Oh my God, dude! All these different people that he uses to like try to explain this to us, like there are points in this book where my eyes were just glazing over from this bullshit.
I know
But
it. Don't you wish that there was just, I mean, like, this is so bitchy and so like, oh, I don't want to read it. But like, don't you kind of wish that there was just like a super condensed version where like most of the references are taken out and he just presents to you what he actually thinks?
yeah, I think you could do
But I don't
this.
think he can. Well, I do think he can. I don't think that would be the same thing. I think it would be like a really different kind of essay.
Yeah, and to give you an idea of how much nonsense, or what I would say, I mean, when he gives the Hegel on page two, top of page two, uh, Hegel gives the fullest expression to the Romantic theory of the lyric, whose distinguishing feature is the centrality of subjectivity coming to consciousness of itself through experience and reflection. The lyric poet absorbs into himself the external world and stamps it with inner consciousness, and the unity of the poem is provided by this subjectivity.
Right. Well, that makes total sense to me. It's the kind of thing that's really weird to read outside of the context of reading a particular poem. Right? It sounds really weighted down with all of this, you know, maybe over what feels like maybe slightly overwrought language.
Yeah, well, listeners to
And
this will know about my feeling of consciousness in this. Distinguishing feature is the centrality of subjectivity coming to consciousness of itself.
so I can see this pretty easily in the context of like a poem from like the High Romantic period, right? Of like engaging with the outer world, where sometime during that it turns really inward and subjective, and maybe the internal landscape is sort of marked as the external landscape.
My thing is the consciousness of itself, and I was like, so the poem is conscious, the reader, or it creates this thing that we're calling consciousness
I
in
think
the
it's
reader.
just a sort of academic, maybe slightly obnoxious way of saying, of referring to the speaker, right? Or whatever is speaking,
The enunciative apparatus,
the enunciative
as Culler
apparatus.
calls it, the
Yeah.
enunciative apparatus. Yeah,
Yeah. I
and
mean, that's just when you're like, you're splitting hairs so much that, when you're in a room with a bunch of academics that all have their own definitions of what a speaker is or what voice is, that you just have to create some other category to call what you want to define,
yeah.
so that a bunch of people won't jump on you and say, well, no, this is what a speaker is.
Well, I like that you said that, you pointed that out too, with like people jumping on you, because I can feel the hedging in this book. Like it feels like Culler is making good points, but he's afraid to make the actual statement because people will jump down his throat if he makes it, well, this is what lyric poetry is, right? Of course they will, because people get upset about things like that, but it really hurts this overall book, I would say, because he's not making that declarative statement of this is what it is. And maybe people would argue, oh, you can't do that because poetry, again, is this romanticized thing that we have to treat as sacred. But like, come on, dude, you're writing a theory. Like, here, this is just a theory. This is your theory. Give us the theory, right? Like, you go through all these other theories throughout history. Give us the theory. And we don't get it. And I think that's because, like you just said, that this idea that if you were to make a bold statement like that, like present a new theory, a new way of thinking about lyric, that like, yeah, I mean, you would have to face a lot of criticism that he probably doesn't want to do.
Well, you
And
would just have to have like, 20 separate responses to 20 different academics who are giving you their, definitions of voice and what that actually means. And here's my long history, and here's all my documentation, and
oh,
provide all of these explanations as to why the thing I'm talking about isn't precisely the same as the thing that you're talking about, or why, I mean, you're basically starting an argument with a bunch of your peers, which is
which is the field. I mean,
okay.
which is
Yeah.
scholarship. I mean, you
It
read what other people wrote, and then you write analysis or you write your own kind of thing, and like how it compares. And he does that here. Like he's doing that part of it. Like he takes a long time to do that. But I just, like I said, by the time I got to the conclusion, and he's like, "Well, I'm not saying I have an answer." I'm like, "Then what are you? Why did you write this 360-page fucking book?"
I want to know
Uh,
what prompts him to be so invested in the inadequacies of current models. And it struck me that he said current models falsify the long tradition of lyric and encourage students to think about lyrics in ways that neglect some of the central features of lyric poetry, both present and past.
what page is that?
That's on page 3, in the middle paragraph.
Yeah, and this is where I think he makes a good point too. Right before that, where he says one result of the centrality of the novel to theoretical discourse as well as to literary experience and literary education has been the development of a novelizing account of the lyric that fails to respond to what is most extravagant and most distinctive about it. So he's basically arguing, like Sophie said in that other passage, that
We're bad at teaching it.
we're not that
That
we're
we're
bad, or that the novel has taken over poetry, which I guess
well,
is true.
and that the thing is, he says current models falsify the long tradition of lyric and encourage students to think about lyrics in ways that neglect some of the central features of lyric poetry. So I assume that we're just talking about these specific models that um, he goes on to summarize throughout the entire rest of this book.
Well, the first two chapters are basically, yeah, him just summarizing that, like, and then
But
him
these
kind of,
aren't models from which I feel like we actively for the most part are teaching. I mean, some of them, yeah. Pieces of them, yeah. But he talks about, and this is also a lot of what I think he talks about in the first chapter, which is, the way that we ask students who are learning to read poetry to engage with it. And I don't know, it feels like he's addressing something without saying it directly.
Yeah, because,
Like, you
again,
calling us dumb, bro?
well, he has to hedge, because if you say that this is wrong, well, then he's going to be attacked by all these things, blah, blah, blah. People are going to be pissed. But whatever, man. I mean, everybody's a pussy.
Like, who is
Everybody's
teaching the
terrified.
models of the lyric that you find inadequate?
But my question here was just like, well, he does go over like the models here, but my question is he correct about the novel taking over like kind of literature education? What do we think?
I would say yes. I would say also more recently, maybe nonfiction.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I didn't think about that, but bringing it up now, he says it's kind of around the turn of the century in the 20th century where the novel really kind of took over, uh, like the education model, how we learn about literature and texts and how to read them. But now, like Sophie just said, I think, yeah, nonfiction is becoming the new way to
More
do it. I mean,
prominent.
yeah, like, uh,
I'm not saying that it's more than the novel. I don't think I could make that claim.
or that
I
it's
don't
even
know.
that different than,
But I
novel.
do see, in my time that I have, that was in grad school or teaching after grad school, um, I saw a lot of nonfiction in English classes. And this is all like, a lot of it I think is like intro classes. And then a lot of it I think there is also like the highly specialized classes. So if you're like, I don't know, taking, my program happened to have a lot of like African American lit classes or like slave literature classes. And there was a lot of nonfiction built into those as well, which makes sense.
Right.
Um,
Well, even I was going to go even more obvious example, like less academic, was just, yeah, I mean, advertising and things like that. Like there's more of this kind of nonfiction aspect to even advertising campaigns, like using, a real story or personal truth or something like that to, but if we're talking about Culler's idea, in the way that Culler's talking about it, I'm not sure that it's that different than like the novelizing of how we read and interpret things. So like it kind of follows the same trajectory as like a novel. But it is interesting that that's changing again now that we're at a turn of a new century, and it's kind of changing again to a different kind of form. But then again, you could argue, right? The more things change, the more things stay the same type thing.
yeah, and nonfiction has also exploded in like creative nonfiction as a
Right.
genre has just exploded in, you
That's
know,
just trend right now, but yeah.
the last however long. I wanted to say like the last decade, but it's probably longer than that it's been
Yeah.
growing.
All right. So this is a long quote on page 5, basically the full paragraph in the middle there. We don't have to read all of this, but I'm just going to read it to set this stuff in terms of I think he really lays down what he's arguing against, if he's arguing against this. So a further goal here is to combat what I take to be an unnecessary presumption of much lyric theory and pedagogy, that the goal of reading a lyric is to produce a new interpretation. This is a recent development in the history of poetry. In prior centuries, readers expected poems to teach and delight. Students were not asked to work out the sort of interpretations now deemed proof of serious study. They might parse, imitate, translate, memorize, evaluate, or identify allusions and rhetorical or prosodic strategies. But interpretation in the modern sense was not part of literary engagement until the 20th century. and writers and readers may not have been greatly the worse for it. They could acquire knowledge of the tradition and develop considerable expertise and power of discrimination without assuming that the goal of engagement with poetry was producing interpretations. In sum, readers appreciated poems much as we do songs. We listen to songs without assuming that we should develop interpretations. We take them to illuminate the world, and we sing them to others or to ourselves, point out what we like about them, compare them to other songs by the same and different artists, and generally develop considerable connoisseurship about songs without engaging in interpretation. We might do well to ponder the fact that time has brought no falling off in love of song, while the presumption that poems exist to be interpreted has accompanied a diminution of interest in the lyric. So that's a long quote, but I think he's essentially making that argument that because we emphasize interpretation, and specifically novel-like interpretation, narrative-like interpretation, we emphasize that, he's arguing, that we lose what the lyric is actually trying to do.
So the thing I struggled with here is, what is the distinction between, I guess, does he mean producing new interpretations, or does he just any interpretation?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I think
I think he means new just because that's how he starts this paragraph. There's this goal of reading to produce new interpretation, but then he presents this, students were not asked to work out the sort of interpretations now deemed proof of serious study. They might parse, imitate, translate, memorize, evaluate, or identify allusions and rhetorical or prosodic strategies. But interpretation here is something else. Like, all of those things to me are aspects of, I guess maybe we should distinguish here interpretation from fostering understanding.
Yeah, it gets confusing here, and I was texting Sophie about this. A lot of what he's saying struck me as a distinction without a difference a lot of these times, because it is like splitting hairs over this. So for when I was first reading this, and I had to reread a bunch of this stuff, well, he said, the presumption that poems exist to be interpreted has accompanied a diminution of interest in the lyrics. So he's saying the fact that we're putting this novel-like purpose onto lyric poems, i.e. to instruct and delight or something, right? Or just to give us a
That's
narrative.
a little Sir Philip Sidney.
Yeah, or just to give us a narrative or some type of character arc, like in an epic or something. He's claiming that has led to the lack of interest in lyric poetry. So it's quite a mouthful. Like, this is a long paragraph. You guys heard me read this out. It's long. It's convoluted. Again, he's using words that take some thinking about when you have to read it like this. But then at the end of it, we're kind of like, he's making quite a large claim here. And he does grant that even that, like, it's still a form of interpretation. So he goes on to kind of keep explaining this song thing, which is what I think is one of his strongest points. But still, it just kind of falls short for me, like, just not enough in there.
Well, it also makes me wonder if this is a response to something happening in, like, a new wave of the academic community.
I mean, it is.
More than, well, yeah, but more than he's just talking about, the average teacher of literature.
Yeah.
Or the average student of literature. I think maybe that he's identifying this as a trend in academia, like among, other people who write texts like this.
Yeah, I think it's definitely I mean, it's not like naming anything in particular, although he does go into different forms here in the later chapters.
Why, you have to wonder.
I mean, I think he's pretty clearly like trying to take a stand, and I think that's why he hedges so much, is because to take a stand like this against the current pedagogy and teaching poems, yeah, of course he's going to get a lot of shit. Although, I mean, he's tenured, he's protected. I don't know why he's hedging
Well, and I
about
think
it,
there is
but
very much right now an emphasis on like the situation of the speaker, which I'm sure we will get to.
right,
But
that, and he does make like the kind of, the biography, which I've said on this podcast, we both said it, like, when you're relying on biography of the writer to give a poem some type of meaning, or you think you're discovering something, like you're going about it the wrong way. This kind of obsession
well,
with
and I mean,
biographical analysis.
there are times when that's really helpful and it can be illuminating.
And this is one of my
But
questions.
if the poem on its own doesn't produce something beyond that, beyond like where you don't need to have their full biography in front of you, I mean, this is the issue. Like I think Sylvia Plath is the obvious example
Oh God,
where
yeah.
people love to read into her biography and her death and use that as a way of interpreting her poems to mean things that I don't. Some of which you could probably I mean, some of those interpretations you could get on your own without knowing her biography too.
Yeah, and that's one
Like
thing
the
I
phrase "Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through." You don't need to know that she died not long after writing that poem to come up with the interpretation of "through" as dead.
yeah.
I
What
don't think
else?
it's the right. I don't think it's the right interpretation, but I think it's not that far of a reach.
Yeah, and one thing he doesn't mention at all in this, which I was kind of surprised with, because he doesn't mention the confessional poets, um, Plath being, probably the most famous for even people not into poetry or
I
literature.
can see why he wouldn't, though, because I think it's so talked about, and I think he wanted to sort of broaden the way that maybe we were thinking about lyric poetry. I mean,
Well,
we're also all obsessed with the confessional
right. Well, that's
poets,
what
and
I.
we have been for a long time.
The reason I say I was surprised he didn't mention it is because he's talking about this narrativizing these poems or a speaker in a poem and how that's not necessarily the way to interpret a lyric. But then you have to kind of grapple with the fact that there was this movement in the 20th century, mid 20th century, that uh, used that as a form of poetry. So I mean, that clouded things, I think, almost more than the novel dominating. This is the only reason I would think that he would bring it up, because he's been so thorough about these kind of interpretations, and he just kind of says, well, it's the novel's popularity, and the novel did get very popular in the 20th century, but yeah, I mean, the confessional movement, I think, has a huge part to do with why we're obsessed with biographical analysis, why we're obsessed with, this kind of putting a speaker onto a lyric poem, as he kind of argues against here.
Or not so much that it's like putting a speaker onto a lyric poem, so much as it's trying to imagine the specific speaker, right? So there's this idea that often in a lyric poem, there's a sort of loose persona that speaks, and it may or may not be, in some regard, the poet. I don't think it matters really. But that when we ask students, who is the speaker of this poem? Who do we think it is? What do we think is their situation? What is happening in this poem? I think what he's actually saying is, in many cases, it's not necessarily useful to imagine a specific speaker and their circumstances as some kind of fictional character
Right. Putting
or
like a
real
narrative.
character or
Yeah.
like a real person. I mean, you just get the sense that there is someone speaking.
Well, that's what I mean. That's why I think like I was kind of shocked that he didn't include confessional, because like that's a huge part of confessional, where it is considered to be the poet speaking, right? Although we can argue whatever,
It,
it's not,
yeah.
but that was a huge part of it because it is confessional literally in that sense. So, and I mean, whatever, he was doing a very large historical kind of summary here, so you can't hit everything, but I was like, whatever. But I wanted to ask before we move on from this into like the first couple chapters about this idea of the presumption that poems exist to be interpreted has accompanied a diminution of interest in the lyric. Like, what do we think of that? Do we think that's why people are less interested in lyric poetry, because they're like, we presume to interpret the poem?
Well, I think that's kind of loaded. It's like asking, why don't people like to read?
Well, my answer to that, I think my answer to that would be the same as the answer to this, which is like, is it because we interpret poetry, or is it because TV and film were invented? Like,
Yeah.
like,
I do think there's something here.
or is it
to
because
the
lyric
idea
poems
that-
started getting very bad post-romantic period, right? Like postmodernist
Well, I think there's more
period.
than that too. I think people are, they look at poetry, at least students. I've often had students who look at poetry in the past and said, like, I don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
There's this fear of not understanding, or like that it's hard, that you're going to get the wrong answer. And then I am someone who does believe there are wrong answers. But yeah, I do think that there is an element of wariness to approaching poetry just because it's more difficult than something that isn't poetry, or just a lack of familiarity with it.
Yeah, and I guess he
And
is...
I don't know if it's because of the hang up on interpretation or just because of where we are in time.
Right, because I think this was published in 2015, I guess, if we didn't mention it before, listeners, and it's like, but he had parts of this, I think he had been publishing since the 70s. Like, he had been working on this theory for a long time. Again, a theory that isn't really a theory because he doesn't set it forth here, it just kind of critiques other ones, but it's still like, I wonder...
Well, that's why it's not called a theory of the lyric or the theory of the lyric. It's just theory of the lyric.
Yeah.
Right? He's just presenting a lot of the theories and maybe nitpicking about parts of them that he deems inadequate or potentially more useful than others.
Yeah. And this is, parts of it, the reason I bring that up, 2015 to now kind of thing, is it does feel like a lament at parts of this, particularly towards the conclusion and things like that. Like, the kind of, people aren't reading as much. It's like, yes, that's true, right? Like, people are not reading as much, and that's a new thing that's been, like, happening in the last couple decades.
Just couple?
In terms of just, like, sales and stuff, if you want to go off that, like, book sales have decreased even for the most popular writers. And that this has been... It's kind of been a trend for a while, but the last decade at least, I would say, you've seen
I would assume
big
that it's been a trend
accelerations.
since TV.
Yeah, but you've seen big accelerations in, like, the trend of, like, less people reading, less people buying books, etc. Like, even somebody like Grisham or, Patterson, King, like, all these people, like, they admit, like, they sell about half as many books as they did, 10, 15 years ago.
Think about the popularity of audiobooks too.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
you're not getting poetry audiobooks, chances are.
Well, that too, and I just don't know so much of it. Well, and I get he's trying to talk about a theory, but that's just, it intrigued me to be like, okay, is it because of the way we're taught to interpret these poems, or is it because we have other forms of getting that thing that we get out of poetry now? Especially in the 20th century, like he's talking about that change in the timeline. But yeah. Or is it just because, poetry sucks right now? Like, and nobody wants to read it.
I think we don't read.
Yeah, well, that's probably the bigger thing, right? And he's just saying that we don't because we don't get enjoyment out of it because of this interpretive method, but I would argue it's because, we're fucking numb from all the... We can have entertainment at our fingertips at any given time. The invention of TV, like Frank O'Hara always said, right? And he mentions.
And we have
Frank
social
O'Hara at one
media.
point.
Who needs TV now?
Right. Well, he does mention Frank O'Hara at one point when he talks about his "I do this, I do that" form. But more importantly, the thing I always talk about with Frank O'Hara is that he always said, look, if you want people to read your poems, well, they better be better than the movies. And, you know, Frank O'Hara at the time, the movies were a very big deal, right? At the start of New Hollywood and all that. Like, movies were becoming the cultural thing. So he understood that, and he knew that, like, yeah, if you want people to actually give a shit about this, like, well, it has to be better than all the other options on the table. And if you're not doing that, they're not even going to care, kind of thing.
Well, and think about how many poets there are now, and how many.
Well, that too. And if the number of poets would be fine if they were good, but, like, again, if they're not good, it's not better than all the other
Well, there's also that
options.
much more competition.
Right. Which you would think would lead to better.
For a
But-
small audience.
Yeah. Or you would think would lead to a bigger audience or better stuff, because there's so much, but it's not. Like, you know, the market rules don't apply for something like art or whatever. Like, it just doesn't
No.
work.
I imagine much of poetry is consumed either by people who are themselves poets or people who are reading poems on Instagram or Twitter
Yeah.
because
that's
their
what it is.
friends write, or because they know someone or whatever, you
Yeah.
know, or because they follow Rupi Kaur.
Yeah. All right. Should we move on? I just, there are part of it, like,
The answer to should we move on when it comes to this book is always yes.
yeah, there are so many parts where I'm just like, man, he just really seems like he's overcomplicating this.
We are going to provide a really probably inadequate overview. Actually, probably perfectly adequate. I
Yeah,
feel like
dude.
we'll hit all the we'll hit
This
all
is
the
heavy
main
board,
points.
bitch.
And
This
you
is-
don't have
yeah.
you don't have to read the whole 350 pages.
Yeah, this is heavy board, bitch. This
And
is what
boy,
it-
were
yeah.
we bored.
Yeah.
I was heavy too. I was feeling fat as shit.
Yeah. Where the hell was I talking about? All right, next thing. Did you have anything you wanted to hit in chat? I had something. Where did I mark? Page 22. This is after.
So
Go for it. Yeah.
the last thing I'll say is that I just want to make sure that we understand that one of the central things that I think he is pushing against throughout this book, which isn't a new thing to be pushing against. I think a lot of people have been saying this for some time, is there's this idea of the lyric poem as a fictional imitation of what he calls a real world speech act.
Yeah.
You know, in so many words. And instead is making the claim that the lyric should be experienced as an event of its own volition and not an imitation of something.
And he tries to define this down, but of course he defines it in this very kind of autistic way, like this kind of academic.
He's gonna keep, well, yeah, but he's gonna keep referring to mimesis, and that's really what he's talking about, right? When he's talking about poetry as mimetic, and he's pushing against the idea that lyric poetry is mimetic, he's saying it's not just an imitation of speech. It is something else. Right?
Yeah, for the most part. On page 22, after he starts in the first chapter, he just starts giving us 9 examples, kind of thing, and he said he deliberately uses these examples to kind of make, because they're difficult. They could argue that they're a lyric, or you could argue that they're something else, right? So he purposely chose these to be able to argue that they're lyric, to try and make his argument stronger, kind of thing. But on page 22, in the middle of that full paragraph, says, when he's talking about sequences, right? So, like, he said this is a part of the lyric, is that they follow these kind of sequences, which he later goes on to call rituals, ritualistic things. You might even think of them as traditions, to some extent. I don't think it would be too far of a stretch or, like, be misinterpreting him to say that. But he says such sequences are more often read according to the implicit model that has succeeded it and now dominates lyric pedagogy. The lyric as a fictional representation of a speech act by a persona, not the poet. He said, but despite the presumptions of lyric theory of the past 2 centuries, many lyrics do not project a speaker character. It is scarcely a requirement of the genre. So like Sophie said, when he's talking about this kind of speech act, a fictional speech act or whatever, he's kind of talking about the poet versus the speaker or speech act, or what he calls the enunciative apparatus. My question was just, all right, what does he mean by this, or what do we mean by it?
Hang on, I want to make sure I understand sequences because I can't remember. I feel like there was a piece where he goes on to talk about sequences in the way that poems might have been published. So maybe it's like a series of poems that all fit together but are not published in one book together, but sequentially over time.
I think in here, when he's talking about the Petrarchan lyric, he just means sequence in terms of like pattern. That's why I said like tradition and or
Okay.
because this is the thing, listeners, when you have these academic texts, academics are trained to basically just confuse the shit out of you with jargon and just like redefine common phrases that like we would normally understand to like make them overly complicated.
Right, because their audience is their peers,
Yeah.
not us.
Although it's us today, bitch. Getting the heavy board treatment, Jonathan. Yeah. Fucking. But yeah, fictional representation of a speech act. That's what he says we don't want to do, right? And I was kind of like, all right, fictional representation of a speech act. I was just kind of like, and I texted, so, what's so wrong with that? And isn't that all writing?
I think there's this. The only way I can make sense of this, and that I am inclined to agree with this, is that there's some idea that there's a usefulness in imagining in certain cases. Like, yeah, there are going to be situations where you do truly have like a fictional persona that is trying to project certain characteristics of a fictional speaker.
Yeah, sure.
There are narrative poems that are not lyric that have characters. But I think that maybe just here it's more. I think he's saying that does it help us in this instance to imagine that there is like a specific character who is speaking this poem, or is it does it matter to imagine where they live in the world and whether they were just recently out of a relationship and that's what spurred this poem, or whether they, I don't know, the one that comes up in class is usually some kind of abuse by a father. I don't know if that like speaks to what my students are going through.
Well, he later talks about like the lyric.
I don't think
as an
that's
event.
actually.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm not going to be able to say this right.
Well, like he talks about lyric as an event later, like the lyric is the event, like the lyric poem. It doesn't have to necessarily be a fictional representation or an actual representation type thing.
Yeah.
Right? But that's what I mean. It just kind of overcomplicates things to the point where it's like, wait a minute, what are you saying?
Yeah, so well, he gives us this example of this poem that, by, was it, how do you say it, Goethe?
I have no idea.
If you look at the page, you see the name Goethe.
Oh, I guess it's German.
Yeah.
Heath Rose.
Yeah, Heath Rose. A youth saw a little rose standing, little rose on the heath. Was so young and morning lovely. He ran quickly to see it close up. Saw it with much joy. Little rose, little rose, little rose red. Little rose on the heath. I mean, you don't need to read much further to know it doesn't really matter who is telling the story.
Yeah, well, that's where I take a little bit of issue, because he does go on to that, right, where he says, here there is no first person or character whose attitudes we have to reconstruct. If we take the evocation evocation of the rose in the refrain as addressing it. That implies that implies an active enunciation, but not a subject or a character. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. I've been sick for a few days. So if we take the evocation of the rose in the refrain as addressing it, that implies an active enunciation, but not a subject or a character. So he's separating out character versus active enunciation. And this is one of those moments where I'm like, distinction kind of without a difference here.
Yeah. This is where I get like, okay.
Well,
Like,
and if I were to
to
argue...
accept this, we have to accept that this is a lyric poem.
Right, yeah. And as we said before, he purposely chooses poems that maybe don't quite fit lyric perfectly to make his argument. He lays that out and grants it. But for me, it was just kind of like, how do we do that, right? Like, how can we make this claim, right? Like, I mean, you could argue...
While using non-lyric poems or potentially non-lyric poems.
Yeah, we could argue that the youth could be some type of subject or character. We could argue that the rose is some type of subject or character. And that's, I just kind of overcomplicates this idea here.
So going in, what was your understanding of what a lyric is? Maybe we should offer that also. Because I think diving in, there was usually some sense that there was a speaker who was an I. Like there is an I in the poem. Whether it is explicit or implied.
Right. In this poem?
Just in lyrics in general. Like that was my part of a really big part of my understanding of what lyric poetry is before reading this.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I didn't have like a whole like, well, this is lyric poetry.
Well, there's a sense of like the subjective, I should say. Like whether or not there's an I speaker, there's at least one implied.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it. We talked about this a little bit with Merwin in terms of what, I don't know, what the lyric, what's the difference between lyric and like the other forms. But
Well, I think it's just like a collection of characteristics, right?
which is what he argues, yeah. And he gets into the characteristics, I guess, around chapter 3 that like make up what the lyric genre is, which he calls rituals, which he calls, you could call tradition, you could call, I don't know.
Well, what is that? Lyric as genre? There's that.
That's like chapter 5, 6.
Yeah, there was only one piece of this book that I found particularly interesting.
Yeah, man. I mean, at a lot of points I just put like, yeah, only an academic could come up with some of this horse shit, dude.
Well, for so much talk about like seeking to like just more openly appreciate poems rather than focus on interpreting, this feels very focused. I do not feel like I was focused a lot on the joy.
Well, he overcomplicates that too. I mean, the joy that you would get, or what he argues that you should be getting.
Yeah, that's
from
what it feels like.
His
It
strongest.
feels like by doing this, we're overcomplicating the joy of poetry.
That's what I mean. Like only an academic could do this.
But that's what that's what academics do.
34. Well, in this first chapter, there is that Zettelman's the parameters, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask you what you thought of Zettelman's idea. So they have what Zettelman calls the domain of the lyric, and this is like one of the first framings that he goes into where he starts talking about Zettelman, a German theorist describing the domain of the lyric, lists several tendencies that distinguish it from other genres. 1, brevity. This is the bottom of page 33. Mm-hmm. 2, a reduction of the fictional element. 3, more intense formal structuring. 4, greater aesthetic self-reference. 5, greater linguistic deviance. And 6, greater epistemological subjectivity. I was just like, what do you think of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of accurate. I mean, for what I know of lyric poetry, I think that's pretty accurate. Just kind of wrote LOL next to greater linguistic deviance.
Yeah, greater
And also,
linguistic
for some
deviance.
reason, next to greater epistemological subjectivity.
Yeah.
But yeah, these all seem pretty on point.
And
And
he does use this, he
he,
says. Yeah, go.
well, he does use those, but he like creates his own out of them.
Yeah.
And these, I don't know, Zettelman's almost seem more obvious to me, right? So colors for, by comparison, are the enunciative apparatus. That it's an event rather than a representation of an event, right? So it's non-mimetic.
Yeah.
Which she goes on to say that they're judgments or assertions not tied to a particular speaker or fictional situation, but voiced as truths about the world.
Oh my god, dude. Oh my god, dude.
3, ritual. 4, hyperbolic quality.
Right, and then he goes into these in chapter
Hyperbole,
6.
I think, is a fun one. But I don't know. Like, yeah, I agree in a lot of ways with the idea of the lyric poem as an event rather than an imitation, because I don't see much use in, I guess, thinking about it as an imitation of an event.
Yeah.
I think thinking about it as an event makes more sense of a lot of the rhythmic qualities that he goes on to talk about.
Yeah, well, then he talks, like, when we get to the voice versus voicing, right? Rather than imagine that lyrics embody voices, we do better to say that they create effects of voicing.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I put in mind. I was like, isn't that just describing, like, like, reading?
Yeah.
Like, as we read something, we create, like, a voice in our head. And that's I texted Sophie about this as we read this throughout the week. I was just like, I don't know. This is getting a little like I can go with him because I think he's making good points, but in between those good points, he's just like really just weighing his own argument down with these kind of like unnecessary distinctions without differences, or like in the case of voice versus voicing, I get he's trying to say that like even if there isn't a speaker and or a subject or character, we still get this sense of voicing, right? Not exactly like a spoken or fictional voice. We still get this sense of like something speaking or voicing towards us as we read.
A consciousness.
Consciousness, you could say that, yeah. It's just
your favorite word.
Right. Well, yeah, because it's like our consciousness then projecting it, right? Like it would be our, or the poem's making it happen in you type thing. But it's, yeah, I was just like, isn't this just like the science of reading? Like when we read something on a page, like we put a voice to it, like some type of
And
thing
doesn't
to
talking about it kind of make you want to kill yourself?
Yeah. Yeah. And then like the lyrics.
Like I really enjoy reading poems and even writing poems. Talking about how poems work at this level makes me want to die.
Yeah, and this at one point it did make me think of like sentence diagramming, right? Like that's what he's like basically like sentence diagramming these lyrics, like.
Not even, but like sentence diagramming, I enjoy.
Oh really? I do not. That always just makes.
I kind of do.
Yeah, makes me just glaze over a little bit. But yeah, it gets to this indirection.
But it feels like a puzzle that I'm figuring out if I have to diagram a sentence. And there's a clear answer.
And this is where
it's not something that you're parsing.
Yeah.
Usage of specific terms over. I have to go get some candy because my stomach's growling. Hold on.
Today's like the first day I haven't taken any like cold medicine or anything.
What?
Today's like the first day I haven't taken any like cold medicine or anything.
Wow, congratulations.
Well, it was because I didn't think I needed it, like I needed it like the last couple days to like not have a fever, like and be like shaky all day. But
Because you got the
today,
COVID.
yeah, I got the cove, dude, the coof. I actually don't know if I do or not because I never tested, but I'm feeling better already. So, been like 3 days of feeling like shit. I feel a little bit better today, but I'm moving slow and my brain is working slow. I haven't had coffee in a couple days because I just couldn't handle
Damn.
it.
Yeah, I hate that feeling.
Well, it would just
Just like
dehydrate and it would
instant
like, like my body
give
was
you
like,
indigestion.
it was like my body was like throbbing. Like if I didn't take like Dayquil or like Advil or something like every 4 to 6 hours, like my body was like throbbing with my fever kind of thing. So I couldn't even like watch TV on the couch miserable like without like taking cold medicine type thing. But I feel a lot better today. But I wanted to get to this because this idea of the effect of voicing, right? This describe and the example that I used or that struck me when I read this was like when our brain creates that aspect. Like this is kind of like wine and cigars type things, right? Like when you say, "Oh, it tastes like coffee," or it has like a coffee note or something in it, right? When you're tasting something, even a chocolate bar or something that has coffee notes or something, right? Like there's not actually coffee. Like you're not drinking coffee with wine. You're not like smoking coffee with cigars or whatever. Like, but your brain makes you think that you're tasting that, right? Like it triggers the receptors to make you think that you're tasting coffee, right? So then my question is like, so which is correct, right? If we think we're tasting coffee, are we tasting coffee, right? If we think we hear a voice, are we hearing a voice, right? Like kind of, you know what I'm saying? Or is that too like,
Yeah. Well, I don't even think it's about hearing a voice. I think it's, yeah, I guess it's like the fictionalizing aspect.
right? And like
I
the
feel
fact,
obnoxious saying that.
well, that's what I mean. So our brain does that to make sense of written text.
But like when you read poems, do you imagine like a single person speaking it? Or
No,
do you just hear it? Because like that's the way that I was making sense of what he was saying. Like, do I
no.
imagine a specific person, even if there's a specific voice I hear in my head along with it? Is it attached to anything? Or is there like some kind of just untethered speaker in my head?
Well, that's why I think it gets to the level of if, even if we're not actually thinking that, like processing it consciously, like our brain is doing it for us, right? That's what I mean. So, like, is the correct way to go, uh, this tastes like coffee instead of saying it only makes me think of tasting coffee? Like, the kind of, it's like a it's like a scientific distinction almost. Like, it's like a, and I get, okay, he's doing this at the academic level trying to make these kind of scientific distinctions, but for something like art, it just is hard, right? It kind of seems like we're spitting tires to make that distinction, kind of thing. But whatever, we'll go, we go with it for the his theory here. The lyrics attempt to be itself an event rather than a representation of an event.
Which, whenever you say that, you're going to get into a weird space.
About the event, or
When you're calling some language on a page an event, right? If we want to be real literalists and like be assholes about it, we can just say, well, it's words on a page that a poet wrote that are then printed on this page, and we, recreate that in our mind or aloud if we read out loud.
right. Well, like he says later on, the most striking of these is the presentation of assertions or judgments that are not relativized to a particular speaker or fictional situation, but offered as truths about the world.
Yeah. I think of, I mean, what's a good one? I'm just trying to think of like a good Emily Dickinson.
He uses a couple Emily Dickinson ones in here, especially in
Uh,
some of the later chapters, because she is one that walks that line, right? And I think he uses her in the example when he's talking about song because hers are so melodic that they carry you through without
Well,
having.
and they were so often in common meter, weren't they?
Yeah, but they were so strikingly like they carry you through, like that always carries you through her stuff, even if there is no particular speaker or fictional situation, right? Which is what he's kind of
Right.
saying. Like I'm like, all right, I grant that. Like it's not a crazy thing to say, right? I just get a little nitpicky about how he's kind of stretching some things to fit this theory.
But I also think there's so much of contemporary poetry that does sort of rely on having a speaker that has a situation
And he goes on.
that we are supposed to imagine as being, to some degree, a specific kind of person you would imagine in the world.
Yeah, and he goes on in the number 3 for page 37 in that same section there for his inductive approach. Insofar as lyrics offer not representations of speeches by fictional characters, but memorable writing to be received, reactivated, and repeated by readers, they partake of what I have broadly called the ritualistic, a concept that will become fleshed out as we proceed. And this is where he gets to the ritualistic, right? He's not talking about actual ritual. Like he's using that word in a very specific way. So like, and when I read this, I texted Sarah, like I read it as like a traditional use of the term ritual or ritualistic, and he's like pissed me off for a while until I
Well,
realized
what does he mean by ritual in your view?
So I would just take him for his word here. So he said memorable writing to be received, reactivated, again reactivated, I don't know what that means, and repeated by readers. They partake of what I have broadly called the ritualistic. So and this is where it gets a little complicated, but he's talking about like the actual kind of ritualistic or like things that we tend to do when we receive something. Memorize it, enjoy it. Like song, I think is what he gets to his song example is the best kind of. And he goes on, he said,
Yeah, that's the thing with all of these. Like, they're so, like, he broadly refers to the category of the ritualistic.
right. Well, he says, I have right after that, if I stopped reading, but it keeps going. I have in passing noted some ritualistic dimensions of lyric, whether allusions to ritual context, as in Sappho's Ode, love poems as ritualistic complaint, or the centrality of the ritualistic refrain in Goethe's, Heathrow's. He puts the German version in there, so I can't read it or pronounce it, but yeah. And he said, I have so far scarcely emphasized the forms of linguistic patterning or stanzaic structure that seem to be central to the identity and the functioning of lyric, and especially to its hold on readers. So then because he kind of wants it both ways, right? He wants it to be this thing of like the reader receiving, repeating, and memorizing, but then also the kind of like linguistic patterning, stanzaic structure, all this kind of thing goes into the ritualistic too. So,
But that also goes into the enunciation or enunciative apparatus.
yeah, and they all bleed into each other. Like he makes that clear.
Right.
Like that's okay. That's fine.
Yeah, they do.
Grant that. Yeah.
They have to.
Yeah, I mean at this level too.
It's that one that I get hung up on, though.
Yeah, well, at this
It's
level,
that one that I don't take issue with it so much as I don't feel like I grasp it as much as I'd like to.
well, he makes it hard to grasp because, again, I would say in this instance, just like everything else, he's overcomplicating it. But it's important to note, yeah, I mean, for listeners too, like we have smart listeners, right? All 3 of them, so they know.
Yeah, we know.
It's impossible to kind of separate a lot of this stuff. It's like when we talk about genres and stuff, like this stuff bleeds. It bleeds into one another. Okay, like it is, especially when it comes to art. We try to separate it. It's hard, man. It's not a nice, clean cut thing that we can put aside. It's always going to be intertwined with the other aspects. And he grants that in the introduction. He grants that in this first chapter. And he grants it as he goes along, that they all kind of bleed into one another.
The thing is, it's also so easy for me. It takes me days after reading to come down from like, I don't know what to call it, like a high of reading some academic that I presume to be, who is better read than me and who I presume to be smarter than me. And it's hard to disagree with something when you're living in that space. So I think I was also uncertain of myself as I was like reading about ritual and like trying to figure it out and feeling like really insecure about my ability to grasp this material. And I would just say that, being days out of it, I'm able to look at it with a more critical eye.
Oh yeah, dude. I mean, that's what I like too is when we do these pods, and then when we talk about it, like Sophie and I are texting all week, kind of as we read through this stuff, talking about it because, in a book like the Twilight, we were just kind of making fun. Like we didn't have to go like deep dives and argue over things like what's he saying here, what's his definition. But for this one, it just yeah, I mean, even days after reading, like you do, we were talking yesterday, even before recording, and then I started adding notes to the end of mine here, be like, yeah, what am I thinking about this kind of, I mean, and we've said this before, I'll say it every time, and this is what makes talking about art fun. Like, I mean, this is...
Yeah, well, it's also hard to critique what you don't feel you
Yeah.
understand.
That too, yeah. And I guess his last little bit here is the hyperbolic quality. What do we think?
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree with the hyperbolic quality.
I agree too. My one little thing that I'm gonna weasel my like stubborn pain in the ass shit
Yeah, I
into
might have one too.
is
Go ahead.
hyperbolic is just kind of describing metaphor, right? Like he
It
could just say
kinda-
metaphor, like, and I get
It
he means
could.
like
I think you could
extreme.
very easily make that argument. But yeah, I think
Yeah, let's be generous.
yeah, I would. Yeah,
I think he means
would say
extreme
the same.
metaphor
Yeah.
or like things that an original
Or even, well,
wild.
it doesn't even have to be metaphor. It could be something like, I feel like rhythm can have an effect that makes something feel more
Okay.
hyperbolic than it might actually be, for example. Like if something
yeah.
has a bouncy rhythm to it.
Yeah. He does. He does bring that Hopkins sprung rhythm into this eventually here.
Yeah.
I did glaze over during some of the meter sections. Listeners will come familiar that a meter just kind of always drives me crazy, mainly because my brain has a hard time understanding it the way they want me to. But
I get really interested in reading about meter, but it has to be well broken up with a lot of example poems. So whenever we got into places where he was doing long paragraphs in between those example poems,
Yeah.
I was like, oh no. Oh no, I'm falling off.
right, and he grants right, like yeah, this could be anything. This could just be an exaggeration. This could be hyperbolic.
It
could
also begins to feel like, okay, we've had a lot of, like, it's really helpful to a degree to have multiple examples,
Right.
especially when they each one builds on the next or like adds a new element. But after a certain point in each chapter, I kept feeling like I'm not sure I'm getting anything new.
Yeah, listeners, this is a text that you could easily skim if you were taking it out for like an essay or like a thesis. You could easily read like the first couple paragraphs, skim, and then hit the last couple paragraphs in each chapter and probably not miss much unless you really want to get into the nitty-gritty stuff, which, hey, this is a book podcast, so we want to do that, so go for it if that's you.
Except this time.
Yeah. Well, if we did it with this one, dude, it would be like a 7-hour fucking podcast, and
It would be impossible.
yeah, we're just chatting. But the last thing I wanted to hit in chapter 1 before I move to the lyric is genre, chapter 2, he talks about the spiritual dimension. So he says, lyrics seek, and this is at the end of the page 38, last bit of the big paragraph. It says, lyrics seek to remake the universe as a world, giving a spiritual dimension to matter. This aspect of lyrics should not be neglected, since it often provides the motive for readers finding lyric words memorable and letting them inform experience. That I found very interesting, and I think he doesn't go into that enough towards the end of this. I was expecting him to come back around to this spiritual, because he kind of lays down in this first chapter each section he's going to hit, and that's why we're spending so much time on the first chapter, listeners. But it's like, I kind of, I don't like the word spiritual, but at the same time, I understand what he's getting at, right? Like there is this, we talked about this a little bit with Lerner, like there's an inherent kind of reverence to poetry, and maybe that comes out of because of like the religious context of it, the celebration context. Maybe that's why, but like there's this inherent thing that we all just kind of associate with it. And then, you know, when you read something and it gives you this warm feeling, this good feeling, this, you know, whatever you're getting out of it, your pleasure, or even joy, as Culler would call it, like, what do we call that, right? Like, other than spiritual, like, it's instinctual to call that some type of spiritual thing, because it's like, we can't grab onto it, we can't hold it, like, we can't, like, point to it and be like, hey, look at this here and measure it, like, and it is a very important aspect to this type of art, really all art, but, you know, in poetry. And I just, yeah, what do you think of that? I don't know.
I think it's like a really, I mean, I think it's almost vague.
It is, yeah, it is, yeah.
And hard to even say anything about. But when you're talking about like the spiritual, giving a spiritual dimension to matter,
Right, yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, he comes out of talking about, and I had to look back at this, talking about how, like, you know, lyric poets might invest a lot of meaning into like single objects or moments
Yeah.
or places.
Or like you said, if the lyric is an event, right, in itself, well, it's a spiritual event. You think back to the Romantics that make it maybe a little obvious for readers, where, you know, just a poem about a tree or something like that, right? Like it's a spiritual. They're not talking about the tree; they're talking about the connection
Yeah,
that living things have to the tree or whatever it is. If you know, if it's even that.
I think it's such a hard thing to talk about.
Well,
Like
it
it's,
is.
I mean, it's the one thing that poets I think most want to talk about too.
Well, because it does hold a lot of, especially when we get to lyrics. So we're not trying to make logical sense of a narrative. We're not trying to make sense of a character in our heads. It's something else, you know.
Well,
Like
and this is
yeah, like
why I
it's
think that there is such a fascination with the uh, poem about poems,
well,
poem about
that
poetry.
too. Yeah, he mentions that. Yeah, at some point, the lyrics tend to be about poetry writing sometimes, right? Now we
Very
could
often.
we could get very scientific about it if we wanted to. Like, you know, we don't understand this necessarily, but most writers know that, right? Like, we don't exactly know where it comes from in our head, but it comes out of our head, right? At some point, like, and this complicates things. But I just giving that spiritual dimension, that kind of intangible thing that we can feel, but we can't see it or touch it, and we like. I think that's incredibly fascinating. I wish he would go into it more, but like Sophie said, I kind of understand because it's so hard to make like an academic style argument about.
It's what I think um, Merwin refers to as, I think he's quoting Emerson, but what Merwin refers to as wildness.
Wildness.
The
Yeah.
thing, like a sense of something just got away, that something just gets away from you.
Yeah, and like he said, you know, it shouldn't be neglected or just dismissed either. And I think this is also what can lead to a danger because it can lead us to romanticize this beyond what it is.
Well, because I think it's inherently kind of romantic.
Yeah,
It
it
is.
is. Yeah.
Spirit, you know, the idea of the spiritual nature of anything and romanticizing something, I think, go easily together. And maybe I'm conflating them a little bit,
Yeah.
but I kind of don't care
Yeah.
about splitting those hairs in this moment.
And all right, yeah, we can move on then. Chapter 2, lyric is genre. I didn't have a whole lot in this section that I would, you know, this kind of genre aspect rules. I was going to ask, you know, what is genre or how would we define it? Like,
I think kind is an adequate word.
for genre,
Kind,
kind,
type,
type, yeah.
category.
Right. That's what I said. Are
This
they
thing is like
rules?
these other
Right.
things. So I mean, I think that there are, defined genres that we tend to keep using, keep changing, borrow from, mix with other genres.
Yeah, and he grants that. Like he grants that in a lot of areas, but that's what I
But
was thinking. Yeah, are they just
in
general
terms of
rules?
literature, it's a group, a category of whatever kind of literature we're looking at that tends to adhere to
Right.
a certain set of, I don't know, guidelines,
Yeah, he says on page 42.
tendencies.
Yeah, and he said, and I agree with that. Like it is. I called it. It's bootstrapping, right? Like this is what genre is a useful tool to talk about things that are difficult or like are messy or like we have to. It's like
Well,
a way of talking about things a little neater than just all over the place.
well, I think it's also important in terms of like distinguishing poetry from fiction. When you get into subgenres, that's when things tend to get a lot messier, I think, or into mixed genres. But even then, things tend to fall more one way or the other, at least according to public opinion.
Yeah, he says, I forget who he's quoting here, but he just quoted somebody and then he's talking about their oppositions. He says, his opposition to the notion of genre was based on the concept of genre as rule, where obeying the rules of genres, as in neoclassicism, violates the creative spirit of literature. So genres oppress and stifle creativity. If it is true, as Jameson claims, that genre criticism has been discredited, what has been discredited is, first, the notion of a genre as a set of rules that a literary work ought to follow, and second, the idea that a purpose of generic categories is to classify works, to tell us whether this piece of literature is in fact a novel or an anti-novel, for example.
Yeah,
So yeah, and I mean I agree with that for the most part. Like they're just and that's why I said bootstrap. Like this is bootstrapping. Like we can be like, well, it's not really that. We can deconstruct all we want, but eventually, you hit bedrock, right? Like eventually you really can't go any further, and you have to pull those bootstraps and be like, well, this is lyric for the most part, okay? This is drama. Like that you just have to do that. And this is where, and on page 44, he goes on. He says, the question of genre is largely a question of which categories are most useful, most likely to provide insight into the history of the literary tradition and the functioning of literature. And I think that's true. I think that's him saying what the aim of this is when he's talking about lyric as genre, right? What is most useful, most likely to provide insight into the history of the literary tradition and the functioning of literature. So it's kind of a scientific way to talk about it, but it is kind of what we use genre for, right? I don't
sure.
know. Yeah, I mean, what do you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. This fucking
To
book, dude.
classify things, to say
Yeah,
this is what this is. This is therefore the kind of thing that I like.
yeah. And I had another question here because I didn't want to spend too much time on genre because the genre chapter is incredibly long.
So fucking long.
And he gets into the historical categories. He uses some good examples, right? But yeah, I was just kind of getting into like, what does this add? One last, let me see what I had. I didn't want to just go all over the place, but he uses this example of detective fiction, which is an easy thing for people
Yeah.
to understand, right? So on page 47 there, in the middle of that big paragraph, as a genre, detective fiction is both a historical tradition, though always being reconceived or reconstructed, and at certain times a functional, constitutive category for writers who set out to write a detective story. He says, albeit one that may tweak or parody the conventions of the genre, and for readers who read a text as a detective story and may be gratified or disappointed by the way in which a given text relates to the genre. The fact that one may read a given text as an autobiography or as a novel indicates that there are historical traditions with which the work may be allied and categories that are constitutive for reading and writing within a given cultural situation. So complicated way of saying that, like, genres just make it easier for us to recognize for readers and writers, right? And it's usually some type of engaging with convention, tradition, what he would call the ritualistic aspect
Yeah,
of the
like
genre.
it's helpful to know if you're reading nonfiction or
Yeah,
creative,
is this a
like
nonfiction book?
historical fiction.
Yeah, dude, people thinking these Stephen King books are real or whatever. Like, they're
Yeah.
like, well, I thought it was nonfiction. Yeah, that's an obvious example, but yeah, that's like a
It is
complicated
also
way.
sometimes apparently unhelpful to know if you are reading nonfiction or poetry. That's another problem for another day.
And yeah, he gets even more complicated, right? Like the theory of genre is an abstract model, an account of a set of norms or structural possibilities that historically underlie and enable the production and reception of literature. So this is another complicated way of saying what we already said.
Yeah, we keep doing it because
Yeah.
we look back at what's been done and say, oh, I'm going to try that.
Right.
Maybe I'm going to change some stuff.
And then my question as we get out of this, I don't want to spend too much time unless you wanted to, anything in the lyric as genre, was just, what do we think Culler's argument adds to the genre debate?
Is he adding to the genre debate, or is he just suggesting that in his view it's helpful and therefore we should kind of care about what lyrics do as a genre? Like you have to, I guess, care that genre is a thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, he goes pretty extensively
In order
into...
to then go into the history of this very specific genre. Say that this is what the goal of understanding genre is.
I mean, he goes pretty extensively into why he thinks the lyric genre matters. And again, it kind of comes back to this. He wants to make sure that it includes this not using this, narrativizing interpretation model.
So does that mean we can skip over this?
Yeah, I mean, we can skip it.
I mean, what else are we saying about this? The claim is then that a broad conception of lyric as genre is helpful for thinking about short, non-narrative poetry, permitting exploration of its historical tradition, making salient its discursive strategies and possibilities in a range of periods and languages.
Yeah. The conception of the lyric that enables us to understand a poem's language by imagining that we are hearing the voice of a speaking subject is not a contingent strategy, but a potent reality of our engagement with the world. So he's trying to broaden genre, like the lyric is genre.
Yeah.
Type thing.
He's trying to create, it's so annoying because he's like, this is by no means comprehensive, but also I want to broaden it to include all of these theories, but it's not comprehensive.
Yeah. I guess that was it for me. Let's say 72. Yeah.
Chapter 3 isn't until 91.
Yeah. Theories of the lyric.
Which is when he started talking about Heidegger. I would be so happy to just skip over so much of this.
Yeah, dude, I don't want to talk about those philosophers or any of this bullshit. But they just get into the interpretation versus appreciation.
Performative versus performance.
Yeah.
Despite the centrality of subjectivity to his account of the essential nature of lyric, subjectivity functions as a principle of unity rather than a principle of individuation. Well, yeah.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of distinction without a difference in this. What he's talking about determining what the I is in lyric, what does it tell us?
You beat yet?
This idea that a poem composed by a poet is somehow not an enunciation of the poet, I find a little baffling.
Well, I think that's but that's like saying, is a work of fiction just, because it's such a specific thing, right? It's like you have a speaker in a poem. I don't assume that speaker is the poet. I think we tend to assume there isn't, like, I
I
don't think
agree
that
with
every
that.
time I read one of these like lofty claims that a poem makes, that that is the true claim of the person who wrote it, even if it's supposed to be what I believe the speaker believes.
Well, not at like that. It's like them personally claiming, or that's what it is in the poem. But I just mean like the act of doing it, like they are enunciating from themselves, even if it's not them speaking or a persona speaking, right? Like
Sure.
I find it hard to suggest that unless you do these kind of backflips to be like, well, because I'm not going to argue that it's just them, just them expressing themselves. I'm not going to be like that elementary about it, but I do think that it takes a little bit of like we're separating unnecessary separation between writer and then the product of that. But if he's arguing that like we need to not use that for interpretation, I see why he makes
But
that
then if you
argument.
do that, you can't like write. Well, yeah, I get what you're saying. I think that it's helpful to be able to separate those things because you can want to write in like the persona of like a really shitty person, which it might be its own thing, but if it's still like, I would argue in many cases that still ends up taking a lyric form.
Yeah.
So it helps to be like, I am not the shitty person who actually means this. This is like a thing that I'm creating that believes these things. So like I think what you're saying is like it's easier to think of it as like some kind of persona or as a character than to just sort of write that off and say it's this untethered entity that is like lifting off the page and
Well, I'm arguing that it
some
takes.
kind of
Yeah.
consciousness or subjectivity or whatever word you want to insert here. One
I
of the
would
words that you
argue
just really dislike.
that it takes more work to do that than it does
Yeah.
to.
To make that distinction while
Yeah.
also calling it a persona
Right. It takes more work, kind of thing.
or just a speaker.
Right. All right. Let's see. I want to blow through this because we're getting bored as shit, readers. This is boring as shit. I marked things, but I noticed like I didn't take the notes here. Let's see what I want to hit.
Let's see.
We
Wow,
says-
I have so many notes that are just like Plato again, Aristotle again, Heidegger. Heidegger sucks.
Yeah.
Hegel. That's like
So-
all the way up to page like 96.
When he says lyrics are constructed for repetition on page 123, what do we think?
Oh, I think repetition's super important. Hang on.
And I think he means like they're constructed for people to be able to repeat or recite.
Did you say 143?
123.
Oh, 123.
But I think 143 he's getting into the meter stuff where I glazed over.
Yeah. Lyrics are constructed for repetition. The principle of iterability. Lyrics are constructed for repetition, along with certain ceremoniousness and the possibility of making something happen in the world.
Right, so he's like practitioner of rituals kind of thing. I mean, I get it.
Yeah.
It's like most things, right? Like most things are written for an audience. I mean, you want something like that. I think he makes a good point with the advertising. He takes like a simple look.
Yeah, well,
like,
I think the idea that of repetition within the poem itself and the idea that the poem exists in large part to be repeated by other people are really closely connected, right? Because repetition in the poem, whether it's a rhythm, meter, particular phrase, whether or not there's rhyme, those are all things that lend itself to memorability.
Right, which is why the song is always the strongest thing that he used, I think. Where like when you hear a song and you get it stuck in your head, you don't necessarily know the meaning, you don't necessarily know how it's constructed, all this other stuff, but you know that, like, you know, the repeated, like, chorus or whatever it is, you know.
So he's talking about Roland Greene's concept of the ritualistic dimension of lyric. Yeah, so it's his idea, the principle of iterability, that they are constructed for repetition.
Fucking
Yeah, so I
theories.
do think that you're right. But it's hard to distinguish those two things, whether they're talking about repetition within the poem or to be repeated by other people, as in to be read and spoken
Yeah.
by other people.
I think in that context he means like repeated,
Yeah,
spoken
I do
by other
too.
people. But yeah, it's yeah,
Yeah, I guess because it's talking about it in the context of performative and performance. I didn't have a lot written on this chapter.
yeah, dude. It's annoying and rhythm and repetition. There were sections where I was glazing over because of like as they were and then when he was breaking them down across the page and like those spaced out things, I was like, oh my god. Like I said, sentence diagramming. And that's where I always get
Yeah, well,
too
some of
like,
it is that when it's like showing you scansion, right?
right.
Like that's when your eyes are glazing over.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, where do you want to jump in?
He goes to this like rhythm is an event without representation.
Again, which is like
Yeah,
such a vague thing. It's so vague. It's so hard to pin down.
yeah. Well, because the rhythm is like, you know, that maybe which is like when we find rhythm in language it enlists us in a process in ways that other texts do not, which is one reason why rhythm may be what is most salient in lyrics. So, like you said, rhythm, you know, all these other forms of writing, rhythm is the most important to lyric.
Yeah.
And he quotes Fry a little bit. We talked about Fry a little bit on the Bloom episode, all that kind of stuff. But he gets to this idea, I'm trying to find it, where he says the craving of, for like metrical or like the rhythmic kind of sounds, like, I don't know. This again comparing to the sound. We'll just skip to the meter section, page 142 to 143.
Okay.
So he says in the very beginning of this meter section, he says, the problem of the relation between rhythm and meter is a venerable one. Among the Greeks, there was already a division between the, oh my god, what is that? Rhythmikoi and metrikoi.
Sure.
The former saw poetic rhythm as related to music, a temporal art, and the latter treated it as a metrical structure. What do we think of that? My thoughts were just they're the same.
I don't think rhythm and meter are the same. I think meter is just part of rhythm, right? Because a poem can still have rhythm if it doesn't have meter. But if it has meter, it hopefully fucking has rhythm. If it has meter and not rhythm, you're probably doing it wrong.
It depends on the structure, I guess.
Because we have rhythm without language, right? Rhythm is an event without representation. Like it's such a vague thing, but it's kind of true.
Yeah, and he gives this...
Because you hear rhythm in things,
yeah,
right? Even if it's not there, you can like kind of create it. You don't tie it to one specific thing, but like you think of your heartbeat as a rhythm.
yeah. Over the past, it is this quote from Brogan from the Princeton Encyclopedias on prosody. The fuck? He said, over the past century, there has been a general perception that prosody is a desiccated subject, a stony little patch of ground frequented only by eccentrics, fanatics, and pedants. Pedants. The indictments are easy to finger. Verse theory took nearly 2 millennia to free itself from the detritus.
Where are you?
Page
Detritus.
143.
Yeah, it's detritus.
to finger, verse theory took nearly 2 millennia to free itself from the detritus of classical prosody. It has never been able to give even an adequate theory of meter. It has been unable to agree on not merely concepts and terms, but underlying assumptions about the nature of poetry itself, text, performance, experience. It has been too willing to base theory on whatever versions of linguistics have been current. It has too often failed to distinguish linguistic processes from artistic conventions, yet the failure to give final answers is not proof that the questions are trivial. Quite the contrary. Verse structure lies at the very core of our understanding of poetry. What to do then? An account of lyric.
How coy.
Yeah.
Account of lyric predicated on the centrality of rhythm to the distinctiveness and the attractions of the form needs at least to identify problems to be avoided and offer some indications of ways of thinking about the contribution of meter to verse structure that might be especially relevant to lyric.
Yeah, I mean, I glazed over at the meter part, dude.
Well, okay, so is he just saying here that while meter isn't necessarily central to the lyric, but rhythm is, it is reasonable that we would look at the usefulness of meter as part of understanding rhythm and its centrality? That felt very long-winded.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Needs at least to identify problems to be avoided and offer. So problems in trying to account for rhythm and define rhythm's role, I guess. We can't define it. We can't, or not precisely, and we can't, we can identify the problems with the ways that we have defined it in the past.
Yeah.
Am I understanding that? I mean, like, I actually don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either, dude. I mean, like I said, I glazed over for most of this chapter here until he got to, like, the rhythm aspect, the rhythmical language.
Oh, dude, I was out of here at, like, chapter 2. The time I got, like, midway through chapter 2, I was like, I'm so fucking done.
Yeah, this is pretty rough, dude. But his idea of... I was going to ask, like, yeah, what you thought of the craving for the rhythmic language.
I mean, yeah, that's everything. I think fucking every poet is just, like, a failed musician. They wanted to be a musician. We couldn't do it. We're pussies. And we're ugly. And we don't want to be seen.
Yeah, this is where I get to kind of, it feels like a lament. So on page 173 at the top of the page, he talks about rap music. He says, the unexpected rise of rap, a form of heavily rhythmical language that relies on rhythm and imagery, and its enormous persisting popularity among the young of all social strata, suggests a hunger for rhythmic language that might find some satisfaction in lyric, if poems were differently conceived and presented. The fact that rhythmic language could to some extent replace melodic language in the affections of the young seems a sign of the profound appeal of patterned language, and perhaps a monitory lesson for modern poetry that has abandoned the more explicit forms of linguistic patterning, including meter and vigorous rhythm. And this gets back, I think he's right, that there's a craving for the kind of rhythmic language and things like that. But this gets back to another reason, like, it's like, well, why isn't people reading lyric or appreciating lyric? It's like, well, we get that in rap music now. Like, why would we?
And if you're not rapping, maybe you've discovered spoken word.
Yeah, but even that, like, it's not as rhythmic, like...
It's very, it's not.
Yeah.
It's different.
It's like...
But it does have a very specific rhythm.
Yeah, but it's all the same rhythm. It's like that joke in Park and Rec.
It feels less like rhythm than it does emphasis.
Like, everything could be sounding like a slam poem when you say it like this. Kind of.
Yeah.
It was like that bit on Parks and Rec.
Everything is a slam poem if you say it like this.
Yeah. And you can move your hands around while you say it. Yeah. But yeah, whatever. And then he gets the sound and repetition. I was just like, yeah, this is more of the same.
Yeah, the whole thing is so like every chapter you just sort of get a new set of definitions that also now include the previous set of definitions. So now you're sort of it builds, just not to something that like I really want to spend my time on anymore.
Well, he talks about how like the sound and like the patterning is what really does it for us. So like not just like the sounds by themselves, but the sounds given a pattern and a structure. What he would call the ritualistic is what gives us the
so now
memorable
that
musical
is what's
surface.
the ritualistic. So
Right.
he is talking about stuff that's internal to the poem and not just the ritual of writing the poem or the ritual of repeating the poem.
Right.
So again, very broad.
Right. And he talks a little bit about this and then sound at the expense of meaning.
Yeah, what page is that on?
Page 181 is when he goes into this. He gives us an example, but it says, poets in the 20th century often fought shy of rhyme, not as a constraint on expression, but as a mark of commitment to sound at the expense of meaning. Which, I guess he's just kind of arguing is like a factor in lyric, right?
Oh, because, well, is he saying that they sort of railed against using rhyme because, they fought against using rhyme because they saw it as constricting their word choice, basically.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to rhyme because I'm going to choose the word that says this best instead of the word that just sounds the best. Which to me is a bad choice.
Well, that's what he says. So it's like part of the lyric would be to emphasize the sound over the, like you said, the best word type thing over meaning. I was just like thoughts. Like, what do we think about that? I mean, I think that has a place.
Yeah, for sure.
I
think.
Yeah, go for it.
No, well, you go first.
It has a place. Like, it has a place in poetry. So, like, specifically in the lyric genre, as Culler's trying to talk about here.
I think rhyme is really particular. I think if you expanded that to other sort of sound repetitions that maybe aren't clearly rhyme, but might be assonance or consonants. Things that also lend themselves, that maybe are not specific to rhythm, but are tools that can help create rhythm or create memorability or create the experience of pleasure when you are reading. Yeah, I think that's all really important to poetry. I think that to avoid attention to sound in poetry is almost to avoid poetry.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. But like, yeah, the lyric can give you another way to create that, I guess. And he uses that thing like advertising. I thought was a good example that he used, where he did the Oscar Mayer Wiener song, where it's just like people that have never heard that song, like, know it. They could sing it to you right now if you asked them to. Like, that song was an advertising campaign for Oscar Mayer fucking Wieners before I was born, dude. And I could sing the entire song. Like, I've never seen the commercial because it didn't air after I was born. But
I wish I had an Oscar Mayer Wiener.
Yeah, I wish I were an Oscar Mayer Wiener, right?
I wish I were.
Yeah.
I wish I
I wish I had an Oscar Mayer. Penis envy.
Yeah, there you go.
Penis envy coming out.
Yeah, I got a lot of Oscar Mayer Wiener jokes as a child.
That's right, yeah. The wiener. Yeah, like he, and then he does this last example on top of that with like the rhyme. We all know this, we all remember it, and then of course in advertising it makes us remember the product and buy it. but for the, it does the same thing in poetry. Like he's like, advertising is taking this from the lyric genre is what he's arguing. But the bottom of page 184, he goes on to give this little. He said, in a wonderful book, Precious Nonsense, now largely neglected, Stephen Booth uses the examples of nursery rhymes to illustrate poems' ability to let us understand something that does not make sense as if it did make sense. We seem to take pleasure in accepting nonsense, he writes, as sense is usual among us. What is the attraction of this strange jingle that we don't understand? 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, and 4 to go, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just how else to without getting into I don't know. I would need to read or watch something on the science of why we enjoy shit.
Well, that's what I mean.
But I think it's
scientific.
just that it's a pleasurable experience.
Yeah,
in the same way that songs are a pleasurable experience.
Yeah, and there's been arguments in music and stuff like pleasurable sounds. So C chords, G chords, like these kind of sequences and keys, like which is the most pleasurable to the ear. There's been arguments about this between C and G and the sequence that goes into those keys. Which is the most pleasurable sounding to us?
Well, and it can be pleasurable in the mouth, or in the thing that wants to say things.
He calls it the enchantment
the
of
thing
rhyme.
That wants to say things. Yeah, because that's the only way you can define this shit as someone who studies poetry and not a scientist. Hold up, I gotta grab a charger. He says something about neglecting the unit of the stanza.
Right, which lyrics tend to do, right?
144. The focus on the metrical line has led to a relative neglect of the unit of the stanza. I have to go back a page to see the beginning of the sentence. In general, the poetic line is the major unit of meter, with a meter defining a line as a certain combination of contrasts, generally duple or ternary. Ternary? And lines sometimes combining into larger metrical units, such as couplets or stanzas, the focus. Okay, so he's just saying that we're not paying attention to whether something is written. Well, people tend to focus on whether something is written in couplets because it's obvious, but we're not focusing on whether it's a 6-line stanza and what that means to the poem, and we're focusing on lines.
Yeah.
Are stanzas neglected? Do we care?
I mean, I guess he's arguing that they are in contemporary work, and the lyric uses all of it. I don't know.
Oh, fuck it.
Because, like you said before, I think a lot of this is just arguing with some type of contemporary notions of poetry.
That he won't name.
Right, that he won't name, yeah.
I won't really clearly specify. I wish that you would just come out and be like, look, this is the shit we're doing I don't like. This is what... I don't know. I'm just assuming that there was some issue that drove him to this, but he's been doing it so long that he could well just be obsessed with this genre. And in the same way that a poet might be really attracted to writing poems specifically about poetry, he's just really attracted to the study of how to define or understand or appreciate this particular genre.
Yeah.
The only other thing that he says, and it's the last note I have before I gave up for real on really fully typing out my notes, was on 168. And I guess he says something about meaning potentially being subordinate to rhythm. Experientially, it is often the case that that meaning is subordinate to rhythm. At least in the sense that what attracts us to a poem is its rhythm, not its meaning, which may be rather banal. It's at the top of 168. But I thought that was true.
Yeah, I mean, he says a lot of true things. That's the thing, is this whole book is like there's not a lot of stuff
A
that
bunch of
isn't,
true shit.
yeah, that isn't like known though either, kind of like,
Yeah, I know. That's what I mean.
yeah,
It's just like sort of really getting into it's just splitting hairs over those issues and go diving into the history and trying to give it context
too much.
and then maybe pointing, it's way too much, and then maybe
Yeah,
pointing out where we've come to some maybe wrong conclusions.
yeah,
And it all makes it kind of a boring read. But again, we're not. This isn't something you read for, like, this isn't something you're going to read for pleasure. You're going to read it because you work in this field.
you want to move to lyric address, or
I think we move to conclusion.
okay, yeah,
Or if there's anything in lyric and society
no,
that you really care to touch on, but
yeah,
it just, from what I saw, it looked like a reiteration of all the previous points and why that is
yeah.
relevant.
From what I saw, it looked like more of
Which is
just,
like, why is it fucking, who are you trying to convince
yeah.
that it's relevant?
I
What,
mean,
like, it's not it's hardly it's relevant to the people who read it and virtually no one else.
and this is what we talk about all the time on this, like this idea that we can just write an argument and then we're gonna argue like why people should be reading poetry more, or buying the books, or studying it or something, like, and then we give all these excuses as to why people don't do it now. So it's the way we teach it, it's the way we think about it. Well, it's like, we just have other options now. Like, we have, like he said, we have rap music that gives us like sometimes incredibly intricate patterning and the sound patterning. Like, like we have movies and TV that give us more entertainment than like reading a romantic
I
lyric
think,
poem.
yeah, and I think there's something to be said for giving poems a chance, you know? I think we tend not to. I think there's something to be said for like giving reading a chance.
Yeah.
I think that poetry can strengthen you as a reader in a lot of ways. And it's really good for that. It can strengthen you as a writer.
Yeah.
But like, why it just feels like why are you arguing to an academic community that this is relevant? Who are you telling?
Yeah. And in the conclusion, he says the kind of interpretation versus the ritualistic dimensions, bottom of page 350. Since most of, I guess I should be in my microphone. Okay, let's fix it. Since most approaches to lyric poetry have assumed that interpretation is readers' proper goal and focused on techniques of interpretation, which generally depend upon fictional and thematic elements, I have highlighted the ritualistic dimensions of lyric: rhythm, lyric address, and invocation, and sound patterning of all kinds. These incantatory elements are very often what initially attracts us to a poem, prior to exploration of its meaning, and of course they are what make lyrics different from prose reflections on the world.
Where are you? What page?
350, bottom of 350. We get
Yeah.
interpretation versus what he calls the ritualistic dimensions.
Yeah.
So, like, again, it's this, the conclusion is he's saying the same thing he said already, basically.
Here's the thing. First, you need to get readers of poetry to read poems and like understand the basic things before you can get to the part about, meter and types of address.
Yeah.
So I can understand, like, I think it's kind of obvious once you get to a certain level that just, the base level isn't enough to, write your whole fucking thesis.
Well, this is why I was wishing that he'd go more into the spiritual aspect of it, because when he's saying this, it's prior to exploration of its meaning are the ritualistic elements that he's listed that we notice first,
Yeah,
type thing.
it's the fun stuff.
Yeah. And so, like, I wish he would go more into that aspect, like this automatic connection that he calls some type of spiritual.
Well, and it feels so important that if it, like, if it, he says what musicality authenticates poetry, if it's so central. I mean, I guess it does come pretty late in the book to be like, bam, But I also kind of wish that we spent more time just like on that as a driving piece of his argument.
Yeah. And then when you go to this conclusion, he really doesn't touch on a lot of what he'd spent so much time on in this, i.e. the historical models that he goes through in chapter 2 mainly. The last thing is that he goes on that connection between song and lyric, which I think is his strongest point. Page 352, first full paragraph there in the middle of the page, where it says, I suggested in the introduction that the historical connection of lyric with song might provide a salutary corrective model for thinking about this literary form. With song we allow ourselves to be seduced without much guilt by sensuous form, and to dwell in the realm of sonorous patterning without an insistent quest for the meaning. But this does not imply that our discriminating faculties are somehow switched off, as Fry suggests in his discussion of charms. In our engagement with song, as we pursue our pleasure, we develop considerable expertise, knowledge of what we like and what we dislike, a sense of affinities among particular singers and composers and of different types of music, without necessarily trying to interpret particular musical texts. Something comparable ought to be possible in the realm of poetry, attending to our pleasure while also gaining confidence in our ability to appreciate what secured our attention.
Yeah, I mean, this feels so much more important to me here at the end. Like, I just feel like this would have been a more interesting book.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, that's what
And that he could have used, like, these other pieces or models or parameters and peppered them in where necessary. But I think that the part about musicality as central and that being tied to the idea of the lyric as an event is a much more readable book.
Yeah, and that was really my thing overall. Like, I think there was just a little too much time spent on the history of it. And, like, overall, I just wish it would have explained a theory of the lyric more, instead of summarizing the kind of complete history of frameworks. While there is some utility in that, it was really overkill. Like, I think his rhythm arguments are some of the strongest. He loses me at the whole, like, hyperbole aspect. I think he's just describing metaphor and stuff like that, but...
Well, that's what I mean. Like, so much of this could have been oriented within talking about musicality.
Yeah, but I guess
I mean, maybe some of it isn't like, if you get into like different kinds of lyric address, I still think they're, I don't know, because I'm not a scholar, but I could have spent a little less time. Like, it feels like I read a couple different books, and this is like a totally solid book that you could use to defend your, shitty junior year explication paper,
honors thesis,
whatever. Yeah, that's probably more of an honors thesis thing.
Thesis,
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, dude, if I hadn't gone to grad school, I wouldn't even be able to make sense of this book. Like,
I mean, we barely do.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So it's not. This is for a very
so
particular
much of it
audience.
is just it depends on how acquainted you can get with the materials that he's pulling from, and in a lot of those cases, it's just like I didn't have the energy to. I don't care about reading much Hegel. Perhaps I should, but I don't.
Maybe
Not at this moment.
Maybe we should vet our books better. We pick these books.
Should. We should revisit our list every once in a while and be like, what do we need to get the fuck off this list?
Well, this one was just like, I mean, I wanted to read this, like, because I thought it would be more of a theory, like more of like him presenting a theory to me about, how
I wanted to read it because I didn't remember what it was that I got from it when I was using it to write my shitty honors thesis.
So you actually used this?
I actually did use it to write my shitty honors thesis. I don't remember why.
Yeah,
but specifically that.
Just give me a theory of how to read the lyric or how it should be, or.
Well, he gave you a bunch.
Yeah, too
of
many
theories, some of which that, like, I guess just were only loosely tied to the lyric, like weren't, I mean, some of them are like just straight up philosophies.
Yeah, dude.
Like some degree aesthetic.
I said, dude, the internet has ruined any type of philosopher for me. Like, whenever I hear somebody bringing up philosophers, particularly the French philosophers from the 18th, 19th century, I do not care. I'm walking away. I'm leaving the room. I'm just like, I don't care what you're going to say, because all these goddamn internet nerds that are obsessed with it, I'm just like, no, I don't want to hear it anymore.
I just find that so often it has relatively little to do with the actual practice of reading. Or like doing what I do. On occasion, something is presented that offers like some insight to my life, but usually I'm able to get that through like reading instead of learning how to like approach and analyze the whole world.
Well, that's, I think, something he didn't touch on either, is that he keeps saying to express the world and things like that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like when we're talking about that, they attempt to remake the universe in a world.
Which I get to some extent, because like when you're creating something, you are creating a world, right? Like even if it mimics
but just
the
say
real
that.
world, but so he overcomplicates it to the point where it's hard to understand without a fucking PhD.
But he has to say universe in the. I mean, like if you sit and think about it for a minute, if you've like read poetry enough, you'll come to some conclusion that may or may not be really close to whatever it is Johnny Culler is saying.
Johnny Culler, dude. Why didn't we come up with that till like the last fucking 5 minutes?
Hey, Johnny boy.
Hey, Johnny, what are you writing here, baby? Johnny, we're theorizing on the lyric. All right, that's it. I'm bored as shit.
Yep.
Yeah, that's it.
Peace.
That's it. If you want to contact us at heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. Subscribe to Patreon. Receive full uncensored episodes for subscribers only, plus bonuses. If you can't afford to subscribe to Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review. Subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app, because that helps support us as well.
Follow us on TikTok.
Yeah, we don't have TikTok, but I guess we could.
No. I mean, we can. I'm not doing it.
Yeah, I'm not doing it either. Yeah. Links to the books and everything we covered is in the description. And the next episode, we are doing Moby Dick by Herman Melville.
Moby Dick.
The big dick.
Big whale peen.
Big whale peen. That's what it is. That's it.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy bored.
I may say the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
shows such a lack of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.